Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last of our 6 Cafe Sci Talks this summer. Before we get started, as a nonprofit research institute, the discoveries and the solutions and the work that we do are created and made possible with the help of our generous supporters, our board members, our donors and advisory board members. And we couldn't do it without them, and I'm so grateful, and I see many of them on this call. So thank you for joining us especially. I also want to thank HM Payson. HM Payson is a Maine-based financial advisor, and they have sponsored our Cafe Sci series for a number of years, and we are so grateful for them. So as in the past talks, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to send us questions throughout the talk. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Because we are in webinar mode, the raise hand and the chat button at the bottom are not available for you to use. So with that, now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Rachel Sipler. Rachel recently moved to Bigelow this July from a Canada Research Chair, which is a very prestigious position in Canada, in ocean biogeochemistry at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and is also an adjunct professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science in Virginia. She'll be launching and then directing our new Water Health and Humans Initiative, which is part of our strategic plan, and we are thrilled that she is here. So our senior research scientists have to raise most of the salary each year with contracts and grants, and she is currently leading or participating in a number of projects, including one where she's working with Indigenous communities, industries, and Canadian federal agencies on a project using knowledge co-production to build a more sustainable future. One that she is projecting future changes in productivity, or how fast the phytoplankton in the ocean are growing and how fast the ocean takes up carbon in the Northwest Atlantic. She's optimizing a microbial process for carbon sequestration as a way to remove carbon from the system, which God knows we need. And also identifying new indicators of environmental change and expanding some baseline measurements in many of Newfoundland's coastal bays. So she's got a lot on her plate, and we are thrilled that she's here to bring her expertise and passion to Bigelow. And with that, I give you Dr. Rachel Sipler. Take it away, Rachel.
Great, thanks so much, Debbie. So I wish I could meet all of you in person, but this will have to do for now. I'm going to start this talk today with a little bit about myself, some of my background, and what's led me to this place to start this initiative for water health and humans. I'm going to go a little bit over the characteristics of environmental change in Maine, some things that I've done to work on these issues of environmental change, and then back to introducing water health and humans. So to first start this out, I grew up on a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. And I spent, like most of my summers swimming, fishing, crabbing, and just being in the water, in the rivers there. And one thing that really impacted my my future career was seeing that there were these seasonal, but also these episodic changes in the river. Because I was spending so much time there, I was noticing these slight changes and wondering what was causing them. So one of these is that sometimes I would notice that after a big rainstorm, we would see the water turn reddish brown. And it wasn't really the color of mud. It was this reddish color that was algae, and small organisms in the water were changing the color. And this seemed to be related to the amount of rain that was coming into the system. We also have these big blooms of what we used to call sea lettuce, or Ovophyceae, that would bloom, and it looks like these sheets of green throughout the water, and that would clog everything up, your crab traps and everything else, and your fishing lines. So it was this big noticeable change that seemed to be associated with when they put in docks and dredge the rivers and build houses on the river that I lived on. So these slight changes in the way that the land was being used seemed to impact the way that my river was acting. So some of the other issues were that I grew up on this river and had a small creek next to it. And when they put in a new pipe to kind of divert some of the stormwater from the urbanized area, or it's not very urban, but the areas where there's a lot of houses, we noticed that there was trash and oil slicks that were coming down into the creek and river around my house. So all of these different runoff from the land use, from rain, and then from these urbanized areas, they were changing the way that the water looked from these oil slicks and trash and things. So that led me to wonder how each of these changes impacted the creek where I lived and how it may change in the future. So this sent me searching for some of these connections. If I was observing this as just a kid on the water, then what were the actual causes that were connecting these changes in water chemistry and changes in the biology of the water to the things that humans were doing? So I started several internships at the University of Maryland and then at NASA. And then I went on to my graduate program at Rutgers University, where I specifically looked at those factors that were impacting harmful algal blooms and the relationship to environmental changes. And that could be from temperature all the way to nutrients and runoff. And this was important because within these environmental, these changes in marine ecosystems are happening not only in my backyard, but they were happening in Florida and along the East Coast. And later on, as I continued throughout my career, I studied them all across the globe. So that includes the Arctic from the Arctic to the Antarctic and many places in between, including South Africa, Virginia, Maryland, coastal boreal rivers in Newfoundland and Labrador, and now Maine, harmful algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico, and sea ice in both the Arctic and Antarctic, melting tundras in the Arctic. So all of these places are changing, and all of them are having this significant impact on the organisms that are living in these coastal waters. So this isn't limited, as I said, to a few places, but these changes are also happening in Maine, right here in our backyards. So changes in Maine's coastal ecosystems, some of those changes are including what we know as global change for increasing temperatures, changing precipitation, sea level rise, changing land use, ocean acidification, harmful algal blooms, and pollutants. I'm going to take a chance to go through and talk about each of these individually. One is increasing temperatures and precipitation. As a Mainer, you probably know that temperatures are changing and so are precipitation, but most of these changes are happening since the 1960s, so about the last 60 years. And this really correlates with the biggest changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global temperature increases throughout the world, including most significantly at our poles. But not only are we seeing changes in temperature and precipitation in terms of the amount, but there are more frequent and extreme precipitation events here in Maine. So the amount of rain produced per storm is increasing. And this is indicated in that there are more severe or damaging storms happen more frequently. So instead of a 1% chance of us having a really catastrophic storm, that's increasing over time. So with those things that we called, 100-year storms that happen once in a lifetime, we may get them more often. We may get them 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. But right now, we actually don't know how many times we're going to see those big extreme events because things are changing at such a rate. We're catching up for that information. But we do know that the number of events that dump a lot of rain, that are really torrential downpours, are increasing. Sea level rise is another one. We know that the ice caps are melting. We know that, that glacial melt's having a big impact on our global oceans. And we have coastal areas that are becoming inundated with water. It's destabilizing the coastal areas and increasing coastal erosion, which is exacerbating these issues. But runoff from these severe storms paired with sea level rise increases the chances of flooding. And flooding has a really negative impact both on people living on the coast, but also the amount of water and other material that's going to make it into our coastal waters. So when we say runoff, we often just think of water going into a river or going into the coastal ocean, but runoff brings a lot more than just water to our coastal areas. When you're talking about terrestrial or forested areas, natural areas, it's bringing in a lot of material that's very similar to what we think of as our tea, right? These are degraded plant matter that is made of tannins and humic acids. So basically very similar in composition and color to what we drink in our cups of tea in the morning. But we have runoff from farms. They can carry nutrients in the form of fertilizers, pollutants in the forms of herbicides and pesticides. And urban runoff is a bit different because it can contain nutrients, but it can also contain chemicals like cleaning products and oils or gasoline from your car. It can also have from gas stations, runoff from parking lots. You see these oil slicks. Have you ever seen it right after a big rain and you have that kind of sheen on the water? Well, that's got to go somewhere. And oftentimes that goes into our rivers or directly into our coastal ocean. Plastics are another. I think Nicole Polton talked a couple weeks ago about the impact of plastics on our waters, but those are a number of different vectors for these both natural and manufactured chemicals to go into our coastal ocean, and those have very different effects. So one factor that I talked about of the building of docks and homes on the river and what that caused, well, changing land use or changing what the land came from naturally of forested areas to other uses, it has a change in that organic matter and that chemistry that's coming off of the land as well and going into our waters. So one is, as we increase our populations, we've increased the amount of sewage that's going into our rivers and our ocean. We also increase the atmospheric pollution, mostly from the burning of fossil fuels, but from combustion cars and everything that's coming in with them. Increased food production. So fertilizers from grains and vegetables, manure from meat production, and aquaculture has its own level of nutrients that's coming into a system, whether it's land-based or ocean-based. There's also the alteration of the landscape itself, which means that we're paving a lot of stuff. So we go from this grass or woodland area to these impermeable surfaces where the water can run off and gather these chemicals as it goes, instead of seeping down into our groundwater where honestly we really need it. Wetland destruction from putting in bulkheadings and docks. Wetlands act as their kidneys of our oceans in that it filters out a lot of these chemicals, but they also act as a buffer from those big storms and sea inundation. So when we get rid of those, we get rid of both the ability to take out some of those chemicals, but also the ability to buffer the big wave action and some of those negative impacts of storms and flooding. Deforestation is another, because it destabilizes the soil, but it also changes the composition of the organic matter and the chemicals that are going into the ocean. Urban runoff, well, anything that we use as humans, we have created so many chemical products, right? And all of those we're putting them on our skin as sunscreen, makeup, chemicals to clean things. All of those products eventually have to go somewhere. And they're making it to our coastal ocean, either directly from septic and wastewater treatment systems or runoff into our coastal waters. So what impacts will environmental change have on Maine ecosystem health? One is that we've observed changes in river discharge. And these changes in riverine discharge, the amount of water that's coming in and when it's coming in, has big impacts on our coastal waters. One is it changes our water color. So remember we talked about the tea color water that's coming in from forested areas? Well, that tea colored water is made of something called humic acids, and it's a little bit acidic. So that acidic composition of the water that's coming in, both because it's fresh and because it has these certain chemicals, it may be, or it seems to be linked to the lowering of the pH or ocean acidification along these systems. Another is the increased nutrient input. So by moving nutrients from one place to another, by the general use, we produce nutrients. Like, just to be clear, when I say nutrient production, when everything that you excrete is a nutrient, every drop of sweat, every drop of spit has nitrogen and carbon and phosphorus in it, and that's getting, put out into the environment. And then the other factor is harmful algal blooms. Now, I'm going to go into harmful algal blooms in a second, but these are organisms that respond and have a negative consequence in the environment. And a lot of time it's due to human influence, but we'll get into that in just a second. So the first is changing water color. So the impact of increasing carbon, which is this water, the color, the humic acids that are going into the water. The impacts of this changing carbon on fish can have a couple different avenues to affect the fish. One is there are a number of studies from Maine lakes and rivers that show that some of the fish development is delayed when there's a lot of this high carbon water coming into the system. The other factor is because it is brown, it actually can potentially negatively impact the fish in terms of visual predation and grazing, because they're not able to see the organisms that they're trying to graze on, they're trying to eat, right? The delicious little organisms that they're trying to eat as well when the water is cloudy from sediments or from this more turbid or darker water. But I do want to say, as I describe the difference between the forested runoff and urban runoff, they're really different in composition, but also their impact. So I did a study when I was in Virginia, and I looked at the impact of different runoff sources on the development of larval shellfish, oysters specifically. And what we found is that when we added forested or terrestrial runoff, the oyster larvae actually did better than the control system. But when we added urban runoff, they almost completely died. I think it was 95% or close to that of the organisms actually never made it through full development, which means the type of runoff really matters in terms of how that's going to impact the population. So we need to have more targeted approaches to the type of runoff that's coming, because natural runoff can be a good thing, even though sometimes too much of a good thing can hurt you. But urban runoff, we haven't seen a positive response to urban runoff in the studies that I've looked at. Ocean acidification. So the ocean has absorbed enough carbon dioxide to lower its pH by 0.1 units. And whenever I talk about this in any of my classes or any community talks, everybody says, well, that doesn't seem like that much. Well, it doesn't seem like that much. This is on a log scale. So that 0.1 unit actually equates to about a 30% increase in acidity. So a big difference when you're an organism living in the ocean. So the lower ocean pH decreases the ability of marine life to build shells and skeletons. And it also can impact their ability to communicate or sense predators. So if an organism loses the ability to sense a predator correctly or in its own environment, then that can impact its life cycle and how it works within its own environment. Now, harmful algal blooms. Something in my heart, right? Since when I was a child. So this has been a major part of my research, how I got my PhD. But harmful algal blooms, they're algae or the plant-like organisms in the ocean, these free-floating organisms that are photosynthesized. They're algae that can cause negative human or environmental health impacts. The thing is that algae blooms, they're what drive our oceans, right? Without algae, growing and producing, we don't have enough food for all the higher trophic levels or the zooplankton and the fish and all the organisms that graze all the way up the line to us, right? When we eat our fish out of the oceans. So algae blooms are a good thing, but again, sometimes they can be too much of a good thing, where certain species, they grow out of proportion. They grow way too much and they accumulate way too much biomass, which means that they can have a negative effect and they can clog the gills of fish, or they can shade out seagrasses so that the light can't go down to reach them. Or they can, when they die, because there's so much growth, it can actually use up a lot of the oxygen that's in the water as they decay, right? When they respire, as they start to decay. And when that happens, you can lose the amount of oxygen that's available for fish to breathe. And that's what we have, these fish kills. Another group of harmful algal bloom species can be toxic. And some of these, they need a really thick bloom to generally be toxic, but some can be toxic in really low concentrations. And these toxins can do all kinds of things. They can mimic asthma attacks in humans and have a number of different impacts. So we'll go over those in a second. So these negative impacts can be the discoloration of water, right? This browning of the water, or this reddish brown that I saw when I was a child. It can cause beach closures because nobody wants to swim in that. When you can't see the bottom and it's a little bit slimy in there, nobody's going to want to go to the beach. And that negatively impacts tourism. And also, you're not going to want to fish in places where there are fish dying. And if you eat those fish, if it's toxic, there's a potential for people to get ill. So that can affect tourism and fisheries. And aquaculture, if it's in the region. The adverse human health effects. Like I said, you can have these, there are certain toxins that can be released into the air and have negative impacts, especially for those that are sensitive to asthma attacks and things like that. They can kill fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and seabirds. A lot of the life that we need in our oceans, but that we also value in our oceans, can be negatively impacted by these harmful algal blooms. And at peak bloom, a harmful algal bloom, or as I say here, HABs, they can kill 100 tons of fish per day. That's a lot of fish from a small little organism. So one, never underestimate a single cell. So in Maine, the Maine DEP classifies harmful algal blooms in kind of two different categories. One, it can be a nuisance bloom, which is kind of irritating. And then it means that when the water clarity is less than 2 meters or about 6.5 feet, when you can't see that deep, that's a nuisance bloom. It's not harmful yet, but it isn't great. And when it becomes harmful is when it's less than 1 meter deep. So you can't see through the water more than 1 meter. And that's really important. Now, this doesn't classify the toxicity. If an organism is toxic and has a negative impact, then that is definitely a harmful species. But in terms of these biomass bloomers, we call them, or these high growing out of control bloomers that are non-toxic, we often see those as having a negative impact when they get so dense that you can't see past 1 meter. So just, in your backyard as a judge. So what causes harmful algal blooms? Let me tell you, I've dedicated a good portion of my career to this question, and a number of people have. And it's a little bit complicated in the number that there are a number of factors that contribute to harmful algal blooms. But one thing that most scientists have come to consensus on is that nutrients don't help. And they're often a cause and can be linked to these exacerbation of harmful algal blooms. So while there may be other factors, if we're able to reduce our nutrient loads, we're able to get rid of a large number of harmful algal blooms in our coastal systems. So these excess nutrients from agriculture or human populations can cause this excess growth. So those biomass bloomers that I was talking about are often respond in huge rates to these excess nutrients. So what happens is, from this schematic, you can see that there is generally no problem in a system that doesn't have high nutrients. But as you increase the amount of nutrients loads to a system, you get moderate and then high impacts, where you start to block out the light and have all of those negative impacts on the ecosystem. And again, influencing factors can be all of these modifications that we as humans do, and modifications to our land use and nutrient loads that we don't try to mitigate. So we've learned a lot. We also have a lot more strategies on how to both grow as a society, but also how to start to control some of those factors. I can also tell you that prevention is a whole lot easier than mitigation. So it's a whole lot easier to reduce our nutrient loads now, instead of having to remove the HABs once they've already been in a system. And it's really important to know who you're dealing with in terms of harmful algal species, because different species have different drivers or characteristics, factors that will influence them and promote growth. In one study that we conducted in the York River and Chesapeake Bay, we found that when we added urban runoff to species of harmful algae, it actually grew much better than when we added just control, so nutrients from soil or from a paper mill. So we're able to say that urban runoff actually supported the growth of harmful algae, where the natural runoff didn't. And that's really important, because that may be one factor of, like we said, the types of nutrients in runoff may impact things differently. So we know that urban runoff didn't negatively impacted the oyster larvae, but it's positively impacting our harmful algal blooms. So like I said, there are many factors that contribute to harmful algal blooms, but one thing that we've noticed is there actually an increase in the number of toxic species that are becoming more prevalent in polar regions. And that's really important, because we haven't seen a huge increase in population in our polar region in the Arctic, but what we are seeing is dramatic changes in temperature. So there needs to be several approaches to being able to deal with harmful algal blooms. And while we may not get rid of them all, we need to understand all of the different species and all the different regions and what's contributing to the growth of harmful algae in those spaces. So how do they expand? Like, how do they get here? Well, one is cells can be transported by the currents. They can be transported, if they're blooming in one space, they can move to another just through ocean currents or through ballast water of boats. Another factor is that many species are already present in very low concentrations in our coastal waters. So they're there, but conditions haven't been ideal for them to overgrow or to produce toxin. And some HABs can actually lay dormant in a cyst form, which means that they kind of close up like a seed over winter, and they sink to the bottom into the sediments, and they stay there until the conditions become favorable. So when you think of a tree, it becomes favorable and it germinates in the spring. Well, what these HABs are looking for is when the nutrient and temperature conditions are just right, they will reemerge and be able to start a bloom from there. So if we can A, prevent those conditions from being favorable, or B, prevent the organisms from spreading to new regions and having cysts in that region, then we might be able to get a foothold against some of these HAB species. So why do we care? So one, they're toxic. Two, they can have negative environmental health impacts. But there are very few things that can negatively impact humans that don't have a price tag to that. And HABs are very expensive. They're expensive to the tourism industry, to the aquaculture industry, to fisheries, to homeowners. Nobody wants to live or have a house where the waters are really compromised by harmful algal blooms, or they may be toxic. One of study, this is from Lake Erie, that says that it's $110 million associated with algal bloom in that area. But estimates for the US, they range from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. And some estimates have even estimated billions of dollars per year, depending on the system. So they're increasing, and they're coming at a significant expense to both the people living on the coast, but to the economy in general. So will nutrient reduction stop all harmful algal blooms? Unfortunately, there's no one fix that we've identified yet to fix all HABs. And HABs can be promoted by one or more factors. But what we do know is that by reducing our nutrient load and dealing a bit better with our runoff and our sewage, that we're able to reduce the occasions that HABs are blooming, which means that we're able to reduce the negative impacts. So this is an important first step for us to actually move forward to deal with some of these issues. Questions?
Unmute myself. And sorry. Hi. Okay, so we've got some questions. Do you know if sunscreen from beach swimmers has any known effect on coastal ecosystems?
So there's a lot of studies that have actually come out, especially those that have been around in Hawaii, that have shown their negative impacts on coral reefs and different ecosystems. I would say that there's new information every day, and the best thing is to stay educated on the products that you're using and to try to use the ones that are most effective for you, but also the best for the environment.
Okay. What is the effect of organic farming?
There are a number of different forms of organic farming, so that's a really good question. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at no-till farming that doesn't disrupt the soil as much, and that's shown to be really advantageous in terms of runoff. Organic farming, where you're not using pesticides or any chemicals, the less that you put on a system, the better. But there are a number of different strategies, even if it's non-organic farming, to actually mitigate some of those impacts. But in most cases, organic farming does tend to use less chemicals that can actually run off into the water. But it's all about how that farming takes place, where that farming takes place, and the stewardship of the farmer. I grew up on a farm, so it's close to my heart that we make sure that we all do our best stewardships, no matter how we approach our farming practices.
Okay, you showed stromatolites in one of the first slides. How are they being affected by ocean changes?
I love stromatolites. That'll have to be another Cafe Sci talk. That's what's like so much energy there to talk about stromatolites. But the formations that I'm looking at in South Africa with colleagues, sea level rise. So a lot of the stromatolites that I'm looking at are peritidal, which means that they're in the area just above the high tide mark. So they get sea spray and they respond positively to it. But when they get inundated with seawater or they're below the water line, they're not able to respond as easily and not able to function in all the ways that we like them to, including with carbon.
Maybe we should back up and say, what is a stromatolite?
Oh, what is a stromatolite? So a stromatolite is one of the most ancient forms of organisms on Earth. And we, in the fossil record, we can see that they actually generated a lot of oxygen in our atmosphere. And that was one of the fossils that said, oh my gosh, this is happening, debatable 3.2, 3.5, 4 billion years ago. We're using those fossils to be able to date when oxygenation happened. And there are these microbial mats, which means that there are these groups of many different types of bacteria that live together to make a uniform structure, and they lay down calcium carbonate into layers, one on top of another. And most of the time when we think about stromatolites, we think about archaeological digs and ancient formations, but there are modern stromatolites that are working and growing in our environment right now that a lot of people, they might be under your feet and you just don't know it. So they're very cool systems that are able to take calcium carbonate and lay it down as a mineral block.
Okay, questions coming in fast and furious. Are there effective pre-treatments for gray water? Tell people what gray water is prior to releasing into the rivers and oceans.
So gray water is what we think of as our less like toxic water. So gray water, if you're using reasonable products like in your wash, that can be considered your washing machine, right? If you're using environmentally friendly products, that's gray water. Things that aren't kind of going down your toilet is often considered gray water. So there are a number of different methods and products, and gray water can actually be consumed through a series of different filtration methods, more easily put back into our cycle to be able to be consumed. There are so many out there. Even there are some manufactured gray water treatment, but honestly, there's a lot of charcoal filters and sand filters and just natural biological processes, including settling ponds and things you can put at your house to reclaim your gray water. And I think that's a great question, because I think gray water reclamation is where we all need to go. And that's going to be a really important step, because we need to start reusing. We can't keep treating all of our water as bad, contaminated, and toxic. We need to be understanding and keeping the toxic things where the toxic things belong, and not losing so much of our water to our own thought of it being garbage. So I think that's a really great question.
Okay, I'm going to take one more and then let you get on. And that is, how do you stop runoff?
So there are a number of different ways to stop runoff. So one, you can, if you're in a big city, you can divert your storm drain runoff into a water treatment facility that can actually start to mitigate it. Sometimes that works, sometimes it's too much volume. Other ways, there can be basically settling ponds or trenches, especially along farming areas where the runoff is able to catch, and then we make basically a wetland where they're able to act as those kidneys and to settle out a lot of the sediment material, take up the nutrients and grow before it actually makes it into our coastal waters. So there are a number of different strategies, and this was a lot of states have actually talked about adapting those buffer zones, and some have buffer zones between water bodies and agriculture. It hasn't gone into homes, but anyone who has a home on the water, a buffer area where you let native plants grow is going to help both your stability around your house in terms of the coastal area, but also to act as that kidney to start to take up some of those nutrients and to block wave action and those pollutants.
Okay, I think I'm going to save the rest of them. We have too many for you to be able to answer on this, but let's go on with the talk, and we'll do as many as we can at the end.
Great, thanks, Debbie. Okay, so we've gone through some of the changes in Maine coastal ecosystems. Again, the temperature, precipitation, sea level, land use, ocean acidification, harmful algal blooms and pollutants, all of these things are impacting Maine. But there are far-reaching impacts to all of these changes. And we often think that we can just go in and fix one problem, but we may be looking at the problem too narrowly to really address it fully. And one of the, I'm talking a minute about some of the projects and approaches that I'm taking, but we need to expand our view of impacts, of the collateral damage of some of these, of pollution, whether it be nutrient or chemical pollution, or increasing temperatures. And we need to use both observational and experimental approaches to identify indicators of environmental change that are relevant to a critical area. So we keep applying what's good in California may not be good here. And we need to make targeted approaches to understand what's changing in our ecosystem and what it may mean, and identifying those sentinels of change, those small organisms like phytoplankton that may respond quickly, the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for environmental change and impact. So again, some approaches to assessing the impacts of environmental change. I have been all over the world, like I said. We've used boats and planes and a bucket on the side of the road, but there are many different approaches. Right now, what I'm going to go through are a few different projects and engaging collaborative efforts that I've undertaken to work towards some of these resolutions. So one is to expand our baseline assessments. One thing that's really important is that when environmental change happens, if you don't know what the system looked like to start with, how do you say that it's changing? You can observe it. I knew as a kid that I was seeing these changes, but I didn't know how that was going to impact or how I could prove that it was changing, right? I didn't know that it didn't happen 20 years ago. So we need to broaden the range of baseline measurements, and we need to identify new indicators of change. We not get rid of the old ones, because that gives us a really long-term data set to interpret, but to add new measurements and new ideas as we start to build them. And this can be specific for an ecosystem, but also broader for entire coasts, to say, what are we looking for? What are we seeing an impact with? And can we start to monitor that change now? So I have a number of collaborative efforts that are taking place. One of these baseline assessments is happening in a coastal bay in Newfoundland, and that was funded by the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And the goal was to look at this bay that is really productive. There's aquaculture happening. There's a oil refinery on this bay where there's big shipments of oil coming in and out of the bay with ballasted water. There's a lot of fishers, and it's a huge fisheries in that region, and people are living in that area. So they wanted to put money and effort into deciding this is what it looks like when it's good. So when a disaster happens or something negative happens, we can start to understand, yes, this is a consequence. This looks like the thing that's changing, and this is how we can fix it. Oftentimes what we've done in the past, and I know that, a number of us have studied the Gulf of Mexico, is when those big oil spills happen, we have to scramble to see what the ecosystem looked like and try to put numbers on the consequence of a big spill like that. And one thing that Newfoundland's trying to get ahead of is to say, what is the value of our waterways? And it's immeasurable, but we have to start somewhere. And these baselines are helping us do that. We've taken some of these measurements from Newfoundland, and we've expanded them into Labrador and Greenland and parts of Europe and Scandinavia to be able to build this network of observations that allow us to better understand these changes and this, even though we're in 2021, our starting spot for future change. Another aspect is community-based monitoring. So with this effort, I've been working with local community groups, including the Atlantic Coastal Action Program in the Avalon Peninsula, which is in Newfoundland. And this group had a research mission to research and promote conservation action for the waterways and coastal environments, and to engage communities in this region. And this is really important because they put together all of these different projects. And when they came to me, they asked for me to help them to both to monitor the nutrients within the system. They knew things were potentially changing. So they came into the lab. I helped train them as community groups. They went out, they collected the samples, they did a lot of the work, and the samples that they couldn't analyze on their own, they brought to me and we worked together to get those samples analyzed. And this is what I mean in terms of providing analytical support. And then when we got these big data sets, we sat down as a group and we talked about them, because just because something's going up doesn't mean that it's terrible. That could be a seasonal change. So we're using the science background that we have to work with community groups to put things into context and to build a long-term observation network. And that's really important because the community gets to see things that we don't. When we're in the lab or at sea, we don't get to see these events, but you do. So that's a really important connection. Workforce development. So I think community-based research is actually the future of science in a lot of ways. And I think the pandemic has definitely shown us that. I have a number of projects that are working up in the northern areas of Labrador. So just below the Arctic Circle. And there are communities up there that have tons of skill sets, and they have all the capability to take the samples for us and to interpret a lot of that data. So we're working together to have them collect the samples, because as researchers, we couldn't go, and we have been able to build that infrastructure. We've hired people in the communities, we've trained them remotely, and they're doing the research, and we're working with them in a collaboration to interpret it. And it's their ecosystems in their backyards. And this is really working in a positive way as we work. This is the United States government primarily that we're working through, and hiring even youth coordinators that'll go out into the community, communicate the science, and also collect samples and learn those techniques to be able to apply them in a long-term career. Industry partnerships. So I've had the pleasure, and it has been a pleasure, to work with wastewater treatment. It's been one of the more fun projects of my career. And this was a goal, is that wastewater treatment plants, they get a bad rap. And everyone says, oh, we'd be so much better without wastewater treatment plants. I can tell you, we would not. They are doing amazing things in taking all the times that that you decide that you need to flush, and using that their resources to remove the nutrients. And they do, a lot of them doing it really high capacity, which means that they're getting tons of water, they're treating it, and they're removing a lot of the nutrients. This isn't the wastewater treatment plants from 20, 40 years ago. We are at the edge of technology. And one project that we were working on was to identify the benefits of incremental improvements in wastewater treatment. And the goal was, is the bang worth the buck? If you're going to spend $1 billion to upgrade a wastewater treatment plant, are you going to get a significant benefit to the system that it's releasing its water into? And that's a big question, because if you have $1 billion, you may want to put in a brand new wastewater treatment plant in somewhere where the plant isn't functioning as well. So by working with industry partners, we're able to say, you know what, your plant is functioning as well as it possibly can. So why don't you hold tight and use those funds to upgrade this other facility that's really contributing a lot of nutrient into the system. Knowledge co-development is another aspect. We're working directly with community groups, specifically my experience with Indigenous community groups, industry partners, and rights holders to explore sustainable and inclusive solutions. So this means that we all have ownership over the experimental design and the data that's produced, because we're working toward a common goal. And we do this because we decide, what do we already know about the system? We talk about what we're capable of accomplishing as a group with our skill sets, and if we need to bring in new collaborators. And then what do we want to accomplish? What is our end goal? What is the information that we want to get? What is the impact that we want to have? And sometimes we lose sight of that. But when we bring it together as a big collective group, we're able to set our sights on something huge that as a scientist, I couldn't do by myself. And as a community group, they couldn't do by themselves. And then we want to know, how should we do it? What is the most ethical and best approach to actually do this research? And not the way that we normally do it, but how can we reinvent things in a new and exciting way to involve more people and to get a better product at the end? So how do we do this? This is a schematic from one of the projects that I've been working on. We can do it through knowledge exchange. And this is that we're learning from the community groups, rights holders, and industry, and they're learning from us, but it's always a two-way street. And it's also two-way training, because we have to get trained in what's important to community members, how to communicate with them, and where their goals lie and their expertise lies. Community engagement. We need to get everyone involved. We need to have more communication about the project as it goes. We also need that project to evolve. We need to have continued communication to be able to pivot as new information becomes available. And we also need to strive for science excellence. So just because, you know, there's been this idea in the past that you cannot have excellent science if you're having all of this collaborative framework. You can, and we will. So how can we help Maine grow while preserving our marine resources? That is the #1 goal. So with Water, Health, and Humans is this new initiative that Bigelow is putting forward. And it's basically science at the land-water interface. And the goal is to help identify issues impacting Maine's coastal waters and to support economic growth. We're going to promote healthy water conditions while working with, learning from, and providing insights to residents, resource managers, and industries who need them most. And how are we going to do this? It's a 3-tiered mechanism. We're going to use observation, innovation, and action. Observations, we're going to identify key issues that are or will impact Maine's water health and those who live here. Innovation, we're going to develop new strategies and engineer products to mitigate these problems. And then we're going to take action. We're going to implement practical solutions to support our community and economic growth while protecting marine resources. This idea that you have to choose to either build an industry or build an economy or protect the environment is completely outdated. We can do both, and we have to do both. One example of a success story, which is from here at Bigelow, is Maine's kelp industry. It's a huge victory for the environment and the economy of Maine. Commercial product that is also used to take up excess nutrients and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So there's a win for the environment and a win for the company. And this effort was supported in part from collaborations with Bigelow's Center for Seafood Solutions. So I can envision Water, Health, and Humans working closely with both the Bigelow Analytical Services and Seafood Solutions to really make holistic approaches to how we're going to move Maine's economy and the environment forward. So how are we going to do this? We're going to specifically design research packages drawing on Bigelow's expertise and facilities to address community and industry needs. We're going to have contract research where we can do water quality assessments, which may include nutrients, plastic, toxins, and pollutants. May include harmful algal bloom monitoring or aquaculture influent and effluent monitoring, and some applying and working with companies to do nutrient and chemical reduction strategies for their businesses. Some potential partners will be homeowners, community groups, municipalities, local industries, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. So what can you do at home? You can shop with pollution in mind, buy things that are more environmentally friendly, and use the amount of product that you need and not too much more. Stop using fertilizers on your lawns. Grain lawns are great, but Maine has some beautiful plants. Natural landscapes are a way that we can help our coastal ecosystems. Limit paved services and promote green spaces. Join or start a coastal action group. Talk about science. I feel like we've had these conversations about science and COVID and all of these things over the last year, but talk about the benefits of science. Talk about the cool things that science is doing. Talk about kelp, talk about algae, talk about the improvements we can put forward to deal with HABs, but talk about it. And talk about it in a positive and excited and optimistic way, because science is optimism. And that's what we need to remember and something that we need to convey to everyone else. Acknowledgements. I've worked with a number of different groups, and they have all supported my research and my development into getting me to where I am today. So now I want to ask you, what changes have you noticed in your backyard? Thank you.
All right. Well, I wish you could be more enthusiastic because you're sort of a downer. And so that's
what they say about me. What can I say?
So, okay, so that, thank you. That was wonderful. You've got lots of wonderful talk comments in the Q&A. Let's see, do you have any insights into the New Brunswick cluster of neurological symptoms, which some speculated could be tied to harmful green algae blooms? And please say what the cluster is.
So there's a cluster. This has come out in the news in Canada especially, and I know that means really looking toward that. There's a cluster of neurological problems in the province of New Brunswick that hasn't been specifically linked to any known cause, but it's very concerning, and it has symptoms that are similar to those that that display when you have some of the microcystin toxins or the toxins associated with some of the freshwater harmful algal species. I can't speculate on what it is. I know there's active research going on. I think that it's to be noted that we discover new harmful algal blooms and new toxins every day. And this isn't something we should rule out, but it is an idea that we need to take these things seriously and to understand our environment and to look for again, those changes and those impacts. And I think that the first step is to take a good look at our freshwater harmful algal species and our freshwater lakes to see how this may be impacting New Brunswick and potentially Maine in the future.
Okay, given the increase in drought conditions, do you see more urban areas capturing runoff to recycle for human use instead of having it be lost in runoff?
I know a lot of large cities or bigger cities are using storm drain settling areas, and some are actually going into wastewater treatment. The issue is that when you get these really extreme events, it's hard it's hard to treat all of that water. So when you have big events that load a lot of water into a system, that water is often having to be diverted directly into coastal waters, even if the intent to remediate that water is there. It's just they're not designed to handle that much water. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. These more extreme events are giving us less ability to handle dealing with some of those runoff sources. So I think that that's where these buffer zones and trying to reduce paving. Maine's great. There's not, when you think about Manhattan versus Maine, we have an opportunity to rethink how we're going to design our road systems, how many driveways are going to be green driveways versus paved driveways. We get the opportunity to build smart. And I would say we need to take that opportunity in Maine to grow wisely so that we can deal with some of these issues.
Excellent. Would oyster shells or lime be cheap enough to consider using in riverine acid hotspot outfalls? And so can you talk about, do you know what a riverine acid hotspot outfall is, and why would lime even work, whether it's cheap enough or not?
So some of those hotspots, and there was a figure that I showed in the beginning or the first section of the slide where we see that there's lower pH associated with river outfalls. It's a really good question. So when you think about the Chesapeake Bay, one of the ways that they thought that there were big problems in the bay was that we had taken so many oyster shells out of the bay that they weren't able to compensate. One is that if you take something from the ocean, it should be returned in the ocean to the ocean in the same state. So taking carbonate out of the water, we should probably be putting our oyster shells back in instead of disseminating them across, into the Midwest. But it's a factor that you have to kind of weigh all of the different things. If it's going to take a lot of carbon to mash those shells or produce that, or to move that that shell base, then it may not. But I know that there have been a number of places that have tried to do shell reefs again, and that's mostly because it's a benefit in a couple different ways. One is you're putting the calcium carbonate back into the system, but two, it's making a bed for more oysters to grow. So I think there's a benefit for both.
Can you speak a bit more about contract research and how that is different from other research and commercial activity which Bigelow is engaged in?
It is quite similar to a lot of the efforts that Bigelow is engaged in. But the contract research, in my mind, is to give an accessible and accessible location and suite of measurements that we can start to build on. So it also gives an opportunity. What I did with the community groups is that we wrote proposals together, where they wrote the proposal from the community group perspective, and we were able to put together these bundles, if you will, of nutrients and contract services that were able to be used for that community group's own objectives. So it's very similar to Seafood Solutions and a couple of the other centers, but I do think it's going to give us this added benefit of having a directed approach to these water health initiatives by focusing on the nutrients and pollutants in the coastal waters.
Excellent. Has there been any further development with brown tide? It was quite an issue in the 1990s.
Oh, brown tide, that's where I started. So brown tide is, there's a couple different species that were called brown tide in the 90s, and that's how, how it all started. But brown tides still exist. Ariococcus was the one, I don't know who's asking this, but New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Massachusetts, all over the coast, there were brown tides were really prevalent. But there were a number of different initiatives for nutrient reduction where we actually put in ways that there wasn't as much sewage draining directly into, I did my work in New Jersey, directly going into Barnegat Bay. And some of those nutrient reduction strategies really have worked for those biomass blooms. But they haven't gone away, and Ariococcus is still blooming quite a bit in coastal bays up and down the East Coast.
Okay, so to be respectful of everybody's time, I think we've got one minute to go. And so I want to thank you, Rachel. That was really awesome. I'm so grateful that you brought your energy and enthusiasm to the lab. I think you're lots of great talks in your future. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, caring to learn more about science. What Rachel said, we need to talk about science. We need to be positive about science. And the first step of that is people learning about science. So I'm so grateful for everybody taking the time out of their day to listen. I hope you've enjoyed the series. This is the last of the 6 talks. And there's a few speakers on, so thank you to the speakers that joined us earlier. We will be making recordings of all of the talks available on our website and YouTube. That might take us a couple of weeks to get them all edited and ready to go, but they will be available. And so please, if you enjoyed the talks, please take the time to share them with friends so we can get the news about what Bigelow is doing out into the world. And with that, I will say I hope you all have a very wonderful evening, and I hope to see you next year in Cafe Sci in person. Let's get those vaccines, encourage everybody to get the vaccine. One of the things about COVID circulating is it is mutating all the time. And one way to stop it is to decrease the amount of COVID out there circulating. So get your vaccines, encourage everybody that you know to get vaccines. That's the way we're going to bring this to an end. So be safe. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the evening. Bye. Thanks again, Rachel.
Thanks.